Okay, so today I'm going to show you how to use Nomad Sculpt, which is an app I've used to render Minecraft models for about a year now. And while it doesn't compare to some PC software like Blender, it's incredibly versatile, still produces really good results, and best of all, it works on all platforms through the web app. So you can just search on the web for Nomad Sculpt web demo. There'll also be a link in the description. And then if you go to this link, you'll be able to access it through a website. It'll take a while to load. And when you first open it up, you will see a sphere. Now, it's called Nomad Sculpt because it's primarily designed to be a sculpting app, but it's really unique in that it has a really good rendering system with good post-processing settings and being able to set up to 3 light sources, which we will find very useful for rendering Minecraft models. So, although there's a lot of tabs and buttons here, for rendering Minecraft models, you only really need to worry about a few of them, which are highlighted in red. To start off, let's just import our Minecraft player. And for that, you click on the folder icon, you go to Import, and then it will let you select from your files. I'm going to go to my downloads, and this is my model. And then it will ask you whether you want to open it into a new project or into your current scene. If you already have something you're working on, you'll probably want to add it to your scene, but because I don't have anything, I'm going to create a new project. So this is my player. This player was created in Blockbench and exported as a GLTF model. There are 2 types of models I import into Nomad Sculpt: GLTF models that I export from Blockbench, and then also occasionally GLB models, which I export from Minecraft with structure blocks. I'll show how to add a Minecraft world or part of a Minecraft world as a GLB model later. But in order to interact with this player, I'm going to want to use this gizmo down here on the bottom right. But I can't just tap on him and then move it, because if I do that currently, it'll actually select the layer that's on top and not move the bottom one. So you can either go to the tab where you can see the layers, and you can select the group for the arm and then move that. Or if you want to make it easier for yourself, you can just click this, then press join. And now when you tap on it, it will just be one object and you can move it. So I'm going to go do that for all of its body parts, except the head, because I want to be able to pose his eyes and mouth. So now those are all joined. And you can see here, I'll just show you how to navigate the movement. So if you select something, there's this gizmo, right? And you can move it in the X, Y, and Z directions. You can rotate, and then you can use the arrows to move it. You can translate its position. It's very similar to Blockbench if you've used that before, and it also has this cool feature where you can enable snap, so that it will go by increments of whatever degree or value you choose. So I normally use for rotation, I normally use 15 or 5. And for directional, you can use what is equivalent to 1 pixel, which is 0.0625. And that means it will move by 1 pixel each time. Keep in mind that because this is the web app or the trial version, you also have a limited number of undos. So that's where using things like this will help you be able to return to your position without using the undo feature. And on mobile, what you do is you tap with 2 fingers to undo, and you move around the screen with 2 fingers too. You zoom in with 2 fingers by pinching, and you can also, if you want to hide the GUI, you can tap with 4 fingers. We'll use that later when we want to take a screenshot with a green screen. You may have already posed your player in Blockbench, but I normally prefer to pose them here in Nomad because it's a bit easier to use these tools. So I'm just going to make a quick pose here. Okay, there's my pose. It's kind of like a casual walking pose. This is what he looks like. Now, the next thing I'm going to show you how to do is to add a light source. You can add up to 3. You access them by clicking on this sun icon here, and you can press Add Light. Now, in scene lighting, you typically want to have 3 types of lights. You want to have a key light, which is the brightest light that's coming from the front or whatever direction you want most of the light to be coming from. Then you want to have a fill light, which I'll show you here. I don't necessarily use a different light source, but I use the environmental light to create that effect. And then the backlight. And for that, I normally don't do it in Nomad, but I use Inner Glow in another software. So for this, I'm going to add one light source, which will be for the key light. What I normally do is make it a bit warmer than it is by default, and I increase the intensity to about 3. These settings will all depend on what kind of scene and effect you're trying to create, but this is for like a standard daylight kind of scene. Now that I have my light set up, I'm going to go to the post-processing tab, which is where the magic really happens. So start by enabling it, and you can see here it already has a lot of my settings, but I'll just turn them all off now and show you how each of them work. Reflection you don't really need to have on unless you have an object that's reflective. Global illumination will just add a bit of light to everything. You can see like underneath his chin there, it gets a bit brighter. You can have that on, you can leave it around 0.5. Ambient occlusion is really, really useful because it creates this nice shadow where two objects either intersect or touch, and that simulates the effect of the ambient light being blocked more in those areas. This will depend on the size of your objects especially, so for players I normally have it around 0.3, and then the size and the intensity, the strength about the same. Although you can reduce the intensity a bit if you don't want it to be as dark around those areas. Depth of field, you only really want to use if you have a background, a 3D environment that you have them in. But in my case, I don't. I'll show you how to add that in a bit, but it can be really useful to add focal blur. But I'll leave that off for now. Bloom is again something that you only want to use in certain circumstances, and it will create a glow on bright surfaces. So the stronger your light source is, the stronger the bloom will be. But you can adjust the threshold, radius, intensity to fine-tune that. Tone mapping is something that is really useful because it lets you adjust basic properties of the color, such as exposure, saturation, and contrast. Sometimes I'll use ACES if I want much more contrast, but usually neutral looks better. And I just increase the exposure a tiny bit and the saturation a tiny bit. I wouldn't touch contrast because it's easier to adjust the contrast with more control with color grading. In color grading, you can use curves to not only fine-tune contrast in bright and dark areas, but also adjust the amount of each primary color it has in those areas. So what I normally do is I add a bit of contrast by dragging the shadow part, make it a bit darker by making it go lower, and then I make the highlight part, which is towards the top right of the graph. I move that up a bit, which makes it brighter, and that makes the highlights a bit brighter, so it adds a bit of contrast. For red, I do the same thing because I want the highlights to have more red in them, making them warmer, and I want the shadows to be cooler and have less red. For green, I do kind of similar but a bit less because I want there to be not as much green in the highlights as there is red, and also less in the shadows so that there's more blue and cool light showing through. And then blue, I do the opposite of both of those. I add more blue to the shadows, and I take it away from the highlights, which, when you take away blue, you leave red and yellow, which makes orange, and that makes the highlights look warmer. This again, all of these settings will depend on your specific scene you're trying to create, and the effect you want. Curvature is, again, one of those things you only really use occasionally. If you want an effect like this, what it does is it creates an outline on the corners of surfaces. So bump will be the outer surface, and then cavity will be the inner corners. Usually the cavity is dark and the bump is bright, but you're going to want to make it a similar color to the light. So if I had this on, I would make it a little bit warm, and also reduce its intensity a bit. But I usually leave this off because I want to just keep it simpler. Chromatic aberration, I would really never use this because you can do it in post, and it usually doesn't create a very nice effect as other techniques would. Vignette, same thing. You can do it in other programs and with more control. Grain sharpness, pixel art can be kind of cool, but that is a very rare use case. Scan line's another effect that it has, but overlays in other programs can also do that. And then dithering you can just leave on. So those are my post-processing settings, and you can see it adds a lot to the overall depth and color of the player. If I disable that, it looks so much more gray and flat. So now I have my player set up pretty well. Notice I don't make him too bright or too dark anywhere, and that's so that when I'm editing him in other software, it gives me more flexibility over how much I can increase the brightness and darkness without it already being too overexposed or dark. If you wanted to adjust, let's say, the brightness of the shadows though, you could go to this lighting tab again, and the environment is what adds the ambient light or that fill light. If you were to disable this, he would be black everywhere except where the light's coming from. So you always want to have a environment. You can even import your own environments if you want to, but I usually leave it on one of the default ones. They have less options on the web app, the free version, but this one works fine. And if you want to make the shadows brighter, just increase the exposure. You can change the rotation to adjust the direction of the environmental light. So for this, I think I don't want this side to be too dark, so I'm probably going to have it somewhere like that. And you can rotate around and see how that affects all of him. And actually rendering the player is something you can't do in the web app or the free version. If you download it on either iOS or Android and pay for the full version, you can with custom dimensions and a transparent background. But you don't need to do that. You can do it. You can still get this nice render out of here using a green screen and taking a screenshot. So I'll show you how to do that. To add a green screen, we can use this reference image feature here. I already have a magenta one in here, but if I was going to import, let's say, a green one, you could just select an image from your files, and that will create it'll fill the background with green. By default, your image will probably be smaller than this, and that you can adjust that with the scale. So you can just increase the scale, probably just make it fit your screen, like that. And that'll also be, if it's 16:9, that'll help you get an idea of the shape and size of the thumbnail as well. Before we actually render this player though, you really want to make sure you line him up with whatever background you're using. I'm going to use this background I made a while ago, and this will allow me to change his position so that he lines up with the blocks in the background. To hide the GUI, you just tap with 4 fingers, and you can see where he is without anything blocking him. So if I'm happy with that, what I can do is go to the View tab, which is on the bottom right here, and you want to add a view. That'll add a camera, so then you can return to that position anytime to take the exact same screenshot. So if I move here, and then I want to get back to the same position, you open up your outline or your layers, and then you just double tap on the view you created, and that'll take you right back to where you were. This is really useful if you want to keep editing the player, but then return to the same camera position. Now that he's lined up with the background, now I'm ready to actually take a screenshot of him on a green screen so I can use him in other software and continue editing him with the background. So I'm going to go back to the green screen. It should save it here in your files. And I have my view set up. Make sure you're set on your view. The view is actually linked to the image you use, so you'll have to create a new view with that green screen if you want to save that. Or you can just go here and change it when you want to take the screenshot. So on view, you also won't have this, the gizmo showing up. So make sure you're on view when you're taking the screenshot. And then just tap with 4 fingers and use the screenshot action. And that will help you get that render out of Nomad into other software. So that's the basic of Nomads, and that's what I use it for most of the time. I'll show you how to use a few special effects though, if you want to, or unique techniques that will allow you to do some special fancy things. You can also change your background here. I usually prefer a solid color, like this. So let's start by adding an environment or a 3D model background. For that, I'm going to do the same thing where I go to import. And I'm going to import the model. In this case, I'm using a GLB that I exported from a structure block. And you press open. And this time you say add to scene. Before you do anything on this model, what you want to do is change your snap to either 1 or 0.5. I'm going to use 0.5 because you don't want the blocks to get off alignment with the player, so you can't line them up well. And also the snap should probably be 90, so you can keep it on that fixed grid. Now, instead of moving the player, I'm going to move the environment so that it's around the origin. So I'm going to move it down. And you can kind of see where he is there. So that's the player. Now, because he's kind of facing the opposite direction, I'm just going to rotate this by 90 degrees twice. And move it back so that he's on the front of the island. You'll notice that this model has a few problems with it. The biggest one is the gray grass. And that is a bit tricky to fix. You'll probably have to do that in an editing software just by creating a brush that changes the color. But if we ignore that, there's some almost baked lighting where certain textures will be darker, like the wool gets darker towards the bottom. So it's not perfect, but it's the real advantage of using a model as a background is you can line it up perfectly with your player, and you can also create effects like glow. So now that the background is where we want it to be, let's just go back to our camera position. It also has the reference image here, but we don't want that anymore, so I'll just disable that. And I'll create a new camera and delete the old one, so it doesn't have the reference image anymore. So this is how our scene is looking currently, and it's pretty good, but you're going to want to use different post-processing settings for the background compared to the player. And you're also going to want to render them or screenshot them separately from each other. So once you have your player exported and done how you want, you can go ahead and hide your player by clicking the eye icon, and just focus on making the background look good. Usually you'll want to make the environment exposure brighter so that it's not as dark. You can change the rotation a bit if you want, so you can see the distinction between the sides of the blocks. And then if you go back to post-processing settings, you're always going to want to either disable ambient occlusion or make it so that it's much larger for the blocks. Because you can see when it's really small, it's just too tiny there. And then I also decrease this strength so that it's quite light. But that looks pretty good. And tone mapping you can leave pretty much the same. Same with color grading. It's really the ambient occlusion and environmental light that you want to change. The colors here still aren't perfect, and I'll probably edit it much more in my photo editing software. But there are some additional post-processing settings that you might want to use now that you have the background here. So if I re-enable the player and I go back to here, I mentioned that depth of field was one that you can use with a background. So if you want to set the focus point, you just have to tap with the camera icon. So now the focus, where that red dot is, the focus, is set on the player. And if you go back to post-processing settings, you can enable depth of field, and you can see it immediately makes the blocks that are further away from him much more blurry. It adds that focal blur. You can do it for both near objects and far objects, and you can adjust how much it is. The problem with this, though, is that if you have a transparent background that you want to cut out, it's going to be much harder to do when it's blurred on with the background. So usually I add blur separately in my editing software instead of in Nomad. Especially because the player will be hidden, you'll have the background separate, so it won't be that hard to do that. If you were going to do this, then you'd probably want to do it You could even add a sky, for example, in here using the reference image feature. But I prefer the control of being able to do that manually. Now, just for a few fancy tricks you can do in Nomad. Let's say, for example, you wanted to add glow to something. I'm just going to disable the depth of field here. Let's say we want to make these glow berries glow. Well, because it's a GLB model, you can't really select the individual berries, but you can select the related objects around it. So when I select here now, if I just tap on them, it will select the glow berries and all the glow berries around them. So if I go here and I press clone, that will duplicate the object, and then go to the materials tab, and it looks quite complicated, but all you really have to do is change it from dithering to additive. That'll immediately make it brighter, and then go to always unlit and enable that. That'll mean that shadows don't affect it and make it darker. And glowing objects create their own light, so they don't really get darker. So that kind of makes them glow almost right away. But if you want to make that even more convincing, you can use that bloom post-processing setting. So I'm going to go back to the camera here. And then if you go to post-processing and enable bloom now, you can see they glow. You can go up closer. And you can adjust the bloom further to make that how you want with fine-tuning it. I think that's the most important things. If you have any more questions, feel free to let me know. Nomad is a really useful tool to create really easy, simple renders on any device. Especially for players, it works quite well, and I use it all the time.